from the Netherlands, and a warm thank you to James Hatch and everyone involved in organising this Alliance for International Education event. In thinking about this online talk, I sought some guidance from a first-year IB diploma student whose name is Hannah, and I explained that I had the opportunity to speak to people who work in international education, some teachers, principals, school directors, and others interested in what happens in our schools. And I asked her, what do you think is important right now? What do you think your teachers need to know? And she paused for a moment and then said, I think it's important for teachers to know how to help us talk to each other. We need to learn how to have our own conversations, but we need to know how to have them without only wanting to win the argument. Well, I thought, tall order. So with that input, and based on some research that I carried out recently with international school teachers and some reading around the question of difficult and how we might think about sustaining engagement with what is difficult in our school communities, I thought I would talk today about why we sometimes appear to be wired for disagreement and how that might relate to some of the things we know about learning, and then move on to some interesting, perhaps promising examples of practice that might help us think creatively about how to get beyond just thinking about winning the argument. Peter Coleman has been working at Columbia University for the last 15 years with the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict and Complexity. And Coleman and his colleagues conduct research on polarizing moral conflicts. One of the tools they use to do this is the Difficult Conversations Lab. And research conducted through the lab looks at whether and how dialogue can succeed as a tool for reducing tensions between opponents on highly politicized or polarized issues. And in the lab, people who have been identified as having different views on divisive issues speak together, and the researchers observe the participants as they talk. And one thing researchers identified were types of behaviors that they distinguished as pro-self, where personal goals dominate above all else, and pro-social, where concerns for others and the self coexist. And it's probably not surprising that they found the pro-social motives in the participants tended to foster constructive conflict processes and outcomes. But perhaps a more interesting outcome was determining whether there were any contributing factors that might impact the participants' behaviors and attitudes in the course of the conversation. They did find that once the conversation starts off with mainly pro-self motivated behaviors, individuals will return to this behavior, and with each new instance of pro-self motivated behavior, there's a smaller and smaller likelihood that an individual will switch to pro-social motivated behaviors in the course of the conversation, which of course in turn leads to higher probability for intractable conflicts. The reverse is true too. Participants starting off with pro-social motivated behaviors are more likely to show these behaviors again. So the good news is that when it starts out well, it can get even better. The other good news is that if we observe pro-self behavior at the start, we know we need to reframe the way the conflict is being addressed very quickly. That is to say, in pro-social terms, if we want to make any progress whatsoever. Another finding of the Difficult Conversations Lab is that how topics are framed and presented to participants in the lab makes a difference to how the conversations go. That is to say, more nuanced and complex presentations of the problem, instead of pro versus con statements, led to significant differences in terms of individuals' openness, learning, and satisfaction with the encounters. The way sessions were structured and facilitated was also a factor, where encouraging defense of a position versus exploration and accuracy of understanding resulted in differing levels of consensus finding. But Coleman also tells another story that I think we can recognize as well, but that requires responses in the context of education too. Coleman and his colleagues were called in to examine and offer some help in an explosive situation in a school community in the South Bronx in New York City. They interviewed all sorts of people in the school and in the community to gain an understanding of what was going on, and they found out that the school had become the site of violent exchanges between opposing gangs. that the police were involved, the principal was desperate, the teachers and parents were frightened. What also became evident to the researchers was that for those looking in on the conflict, so the parents, the teachers, the principal, the local pastor who had been called in, the counsellor, the problem was described as being very complex. But for the people involved on the inside, the adolescents in this case, the problem was very simple. The problem was them, the other guys. There was nothing complex about it. And this is another feature of conflict that Coleman, among others, recognizes. While we know that viewing situations as complex and nuanced can lead to more consensus building, potentially to defining areas of overlap and common ground, there are strong psychological drivers that push us to view the others, those people over there, as the problem. And we know that this in-group, out-group bias emerges quickly, merely by identifying or being identified as a member of one group and not another group, as research in the field of social identity theory has shown us over the past half century. There is some evidence to suggest that a statement such as this might be true. It's not only the work of social psychologists such as Tajfel and Turner that illustrate to us that when we are in a situation that activates our group identity over our personal identity, we appear to have a psychological tendency to view problems through the lens of our own group first, and in doing so, veer towards something simpler. There appear to be other mechanisms at work that push our thinking towards simplicity. Daniel Kahneman, in his international bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow, brought dual system theory from the field of cognitive psychology into our daily parlance. Kahneman describes two types of thinking to help us to envision them, System 1 and System 2. Sloman has referred to associative versus rule-based thinking, and later intuitive thinking versus deliberative thinking. Kahneman spends a lot of time describing System 1, the thinking fast system, the quick, automatic, associative, and affective-based form of thinking, primarily because its influence on the way we act and make decisions is often underestimated and unseen. It's automatic, often relying on unconscious associative processes, and of particular interest, I think, for the point I wish to make here, it's not very good at thinking about many things at once. Kahneman takes thinking statistically as his primary example. That is, he identifies numerous occasions when our responses to questions are not based on statistical information, which we may indeed have access to, but instead on what our mind can most easily reach for, which often corresponds to what is most recent or most impactful in intensity. In his work, he gives a number of different examples of how System 1 provides quick and automatic answers to questions. I like the Scrabble example. For me, it's simple and very, very true. When asked to consider the letter K in the English language and whether it's more likely to appear as the first letter in a word or the third letter in a word, people exaggerated the frequency of the letter K appearing in the first position, because it's easier to come up with words that begin with a letter than to come up with words with a letter in the third position. We remember those words more easily, and this ease of memory, which Kahneman and his colleague Tversky called the availability heuristic, leads us to beliefs that are based less on fact, less on measurable instances or statistics, and more on what we remember in the moment of being asked. So, we appear to have different sources of evidence that suggest that we tend towards simplification and towards speed when seeking to make sense of our world. Clearly, the good news is that automation of a system can leave more room for engagement without other types of complexity. We see this, for example, in learning to read, where the goal is to automate the letter-by-letter decoding that is required to translate marks written on a page or screen into meaning without passing through the phonetic sounding out that generally characterizes early reading. By automating this process, we have more cognitive space to engage with the meaning of what is written, rather than the letters or signs that transmit that meaning. But how and when do we move away from cognitive ease towards the type of complexity that might lead to the types of conversation that Hannah defined earlier? Some of you may be familiar with James Nottingham and his work. His 2017 book, The Learning Challenge, How to Guide Your Students Through the Learning Pit, to achieve deeper understanding has as its cover photo, which I particularly like, this precarious path and these mountains in the distance and the desirable end point. But actually, Nottingham says that we have to go through the pit, which I wonder is what lies on the other side of the precipice. Or perhaps the editors couldn't really decide on an appropriate photo of a pit or being in a pit, or looking up from a pit, and decided to leave a little metaphorical wiggle room. Not much wiggling on this path, though. But the point I wish to make from Nottingham's work is his understanding that being in the pit is necessary. The pit, of course, is a metaphor for stepping out of the comfort zone, to explore ideas, I quote, or contradictions that are complex and perplexing, unquote. It's a mental state or a space when people are in a state of cognitive conflict, when you have many ideas that make sense each on their own, but when juxtaposed appear to conflict with each other. The pit represents having multiple ideas that haven't been sorted out yet, and you're not in the pit if you have no ideas. And you work your way out of the pit by doing the difficult and uncomfortable work of moving from separate concepts to identifying contradictions, examining options, and trying to form meaning, connecting, and explaining. Nottingham provides some school-age example statements to illustrate what's meant by cognitive conflict, such as this one: stealing is wrong, but Robin Hood did the right thing. In some ways, I think that Coleman's difficult conversations lab is a sort of pit. However, in the lab, the separate concepts are embodied in two people rather than in one person's mind. And as long as those concepts remain separate in the minds of the two people, rather than multiple concepts in one mind, we risk simplified thinking and social polarization. Many theorists have recognized the place that cognitive conflict has in our growth. Piaget called this disequilibrium, a state of discomfort that comes when things are no longer fitting together nicely, where something new has come along and doesn't fit in. Debra developed the concept of difficult knowledge from a psychoanalytical perspective to describe the inner impact of knowledge being presented to the individual that may conflict with personal or cultural truths, with what one knows, and potentially with who one thinks one is. And one is faced with the possibility of expansion and growth, but equally with trauma and rigidity. So what Nottingham, Piaget, Britzman, to take examples, imply is that complexity is uncomfortable and destabilizing. What then are some of the implications of this for our work in education? I recently conducted some research in relation to teacher beliefs about the intersection of the development of intercultural understanding and identity, and at the time I was interested in hearing experienced teachers talk about themselves and their work. Teachers who had been working in the field of international education for a number of years, who had experienced a number of different school environments in a number of countries, on the premise that these teachers would have their own experiences to draw on as professionals and in personal ways as well. A number of points emerged from the conversations I had with these very committed and very thoughtful professionals, but one in particular relates to Hannah's request. Many, not all, but many of the teachers I spoke with voiced a real aversion to engaging with complex identity issues in the classroom, or thought their international school was not doing a good job engaging with difficult issues in general. I'm not referring here to what we might call personal identity issues, or identity issues lived and expressed as personal, because clearly the social framework is always at work when we refer to concept as old as the third culture kid or culture shock, or the more recently implemented concept of intersectionality. What teachers voiced was a sense that engaging with topics that drew more overtly on belief systems related to identity, on values priorities, on religious beliefs, on political stance, that became identity issues in the classroom, became therefore risky. It was a rocky, slippery, mine-filled terrain. And that's not to say that this is the case for everyone. We all know perhaps many of you are actively involved in the classroom or in clubs or extracurricular activities or leading schools that do just this, that create a forum where engagement with these topics is at the center of your work. But The fact that some teachers who would otherwise identify themselves as having a high level of intercultural understanding shied away from this engagement got me thinking. I saw a paradox in part of our professional knowledge base that recognizes that it is in the borderlands, as Alan has said, in the crossing of frontiers, written about by Hayden Thompson, in the areas of discomfort that real learning happens, and a discomfort with the idea of discomfort that teachers held. We as teachers have been taught that good classroom management includes ways of talking, ways of exchanging ideas, presenting information, ways of disagreeing. We expect our classrooms to be places of respect. We're encouraged to see our classrooms as safe spaces, our relationships with students as safe spaces. And it may be that inviting thorny issues into the classroom would threaten those norms. That assumption is based on another assumption or intuition, which is that certain topics are so emotionally fraught that the rules of good conduct are laid aside. Perhaps the teachers I spoke to didn't feel informed enough about the topics and did not feel that they had enough practice as mediators of disagreement or conflict, that their discomfort was rooted in the feeling of not being properly prepared to manage a situation that required some balance between freedom of expression and protecting the rights of others, to not feel threatened or belittled or harmed by the words and thoughts of others. So Nottingham would point out that creating these situations is the job of the teacher, and he might also observe that I've talked my way into the pit, where different ideas are held in one mental space, colliding, contradicting, and creating discomfort. How do we climb out? I think this is the interesting part. It involves creativity, courage, and I don't offer the following examples as solutions for all, but simply for points of reflection and reason for optimism. The creative arts offer some opportunities for listening to different voices and different points of view. This slide here shows some beautiful mural work done by children involved in projects run by an association called Artolution. In these projects, teaching artists facilitate community-based public art programmed with displaced youth, with refugees in Europe and in South America, around the world. And these programs provide a platform for young people to creatively explore their experiences, to promote reconciliation, to discuss goals for their future. And it creates forums in which young people can open up about, at times, extremely painful experiences. A lot of importance is given to narrative storytelling and the creation of characters as a way to explore identity and to explore difficult topics. Imagine a different scenario, a school where more than 50 languages are spoken, a classroom in that school, students from more than 15 different home countries have met as they do each week to improve their English language skills. The teacher, Miss Clancy, is using poetry. She's using Carol Ann Duffy's poem originally to work on vocabulary, and in particular on line breaks in the poetry, and students are trying to work out how the line breaks emphasize certain words, certain ideas. And it's the end of class, and Miss Clancy is leaning over to look at what one student, a particularly silent young woman who hasn't spoken, who rarely speaks, has been writing. This is a true story. Priya, the young woman, migrated from Bangladesh with her family when she was 6, and Miss Clancy, who is a real teacher, seeing the space that poetry created for this young woman, begins what was known among her colleagues as the Very Quiet Foreign Girls Poetry Group, where the silence of trauma and loss of these young women who had migrated with their families from other places, where they found voice. I was also interested to read about a workshop that was run out of the Manchester Metropolitan University recently, where researchers were interested in looking at the possibilities of agonistic pedagogy for global citizenship education. So they brought together a very diverse group in terms of age and created activities where disagreement was actually fostered. And they did this to see whether conflict could be normalized, so a different approach to what I'm looking at here, and where emotion could be channeled in a way to create new thinking, new engagement with others. And while I won't summarize the entire article here, it was interesting to see in their initial results that there were strong efforts by some to actually go against the instructional guidance of the activities and seek consensual agreement, and particularly by the older participants in the activities. The children were actually able to escalate the debates more than was possible for the adults. And this reluctance on the part of adults corroborates what I had found with international teachers and aligns with other research studies that show that educators have less positive attitudes towards conflict-orientated pedagogies. They also noticed that in those cases of adversarial discussion, participants were able to make a distinction between what they called political emotion versus moral emotion, and that this was understood as being a necessary part of the democratic process. There's been recent attention to the value of a paradox mindset, which I think relates here. The paradox mindset indicating the extent to which individuals embrace and are energized by tensions. And the adoption of a paradox mindset is being seen as a way of helping people actually leverage the tensions to produce creative outputs. And the idea that accepting oppositions rather than rejecting them can open up rather than close options. It reminds me a bit of Zaretta Hammond's idea of productive struggle. So these projects, research projects, and concepts that I have just referred to are all grounded in the principle of multi-voicedness, which is a concept that can be traced back to the Russian linguist Bakhtin, who worked during the early 20th century. And Bakhtin's use of this concept, which is also translated as heteroglossia, was to point to instances of language use that broke through or made cracks in the singular authoritarian discourse. And he described this multi-voicedness as a fluid, moving, never settled state of affairs. In an interview published in The Guardian a few months ago, Odette Hotel gives voice and discursive space to historical and contemporary people in her book African Europeans, An Untold Story. And these are stories of people who have been overlooked because, as she explains, we only want to present stories that are easy to understand stories that put people of African descent in boxes. When stories are easy to understand, they are easy to control. This reminds me of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk back in 2009, where she addresses the danger of a single story and the importance of multi-voicedness. In her book Beyond Guilt Trips, Anu Taranath writes about how the delicate balancing act of holding on to conflicting thoughts and multiple voices requires practice and skill. One of the main strengths of the book, I think, is its rare engagement with the fact that building critical thinking through experiential education, which is the topic of her book, opens students' eyes to the heavy weight of new knowledge about the status quo. And the author talks frankly about the need to counter waves of despair or paralysis in these coming to truth moments, which are not often openly acknowledged, I find, in literature on developing global citizens or intercultural competencies. And she asks each of us to recognize, the author asks each of us to recognize that a world of joy coexists with a world of suffering. And I don't think this is to be considered a Pollyanna platitude, but a path to hopeful growth. And she illustrates the inclusive framework for thought that the seemingly simple word "and" allows. It's a little word that allows us to hold complexity together. So an open conversation navigates between honesty and discomfort. We need to be critical and compassionate when thinking about our do-good activities. Our global experiences and our local lives can be improved by mindful travel. Our unexamined thought processes can be comforting and narrow-minded. So I've offered a few thoughts. I will quieten my voice and open the space for others with our discussion questions, and close Just thinking about how complexity comes from ensuring we have multi-voicedness. How we frame our discussions turns them into debates or dialogues, and we can plant those seeds at a very young age. If our engagement with cognitive complexity is translated into a pro or con, winner takes all endeavor, we create one set of emotional associations in our students about how engaging with complexity feels. If instead we frame the engagement as creative endeavor with many entry points, multiple points of view, multiple voices, perhaps we get closer to having conversations with each other where the point is not getting the prize, but the prize is in the relentless push for more dialogue. Thank you.